A quiet winter evening takes a chilling turn when a loyal German Shepherd returns home, carrying what looks like a tiny, shivering puppy. But as the owner holds the creature under the warm light, she realizes it's no ordinary puppy. It's a rare fox kit, badly scarred and clinging to life. Determined to protect it, she unknowingly stumbles into a web of secrets and danger lurking in her small town. Who left the fox to die? What terrifying truth is hiding in the woods behind her home? And how far will she go to uncover the answers? This gripping story of courage, family, and redemption will leave you on the edge of your seat. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The winter wind rattled the windows of Carter's Comfort as Maggie Carter moved through her familiar closing routine. Her weathered hands worked the cleaning cloth across the worn counter in slow, methodical circles. The diner's overhead lights cast a warm glow against the darkness outside, creating a cozy bubble that felt both comforting and somehow lonely. "Another day done, Max," she said softly to her German Shepherd, who lay near the door, his chin resting on his paws. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and his tail thumped gently against the floor. Maggie glanced at the empty chair behind the register where Tom used to sit, doing the day's receipts. 10 years had passed since she'd lost him, but some nights, like tonight, the memories felt as fresh as yesterday. She could almost hear his deep laugh echoing through the quiet diner, the way he'd tease her about being too generous with the pie portions. "Your dad always said I had a soft spot for strays," she told Max, lifting chairs onto tables with practiced ease. The big dog watched her intently, following her movements as she worked. "He's the one who couldn't say no to you, though, wasn't he, boy?" The clock on the wall showed 7:30 p.m. Outside, the temperature had dropped well below freezing, and frost patterns were forming on the windows. Maggie pulled on her thick winter coat, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and clicked Max's leash into place. As she stepped outside and turned to lock the door, Max suddenly stiffened. His bark shattered the evening quiet, deep and urgent. Before Maggie could tighten her grip, he yanked forward, pulling against the leash with unusual force. "Max, what's gotten into you?" she scolded, but something in his behavior made her pause. In 10 years, he'd never acted like this. After a moment's hesitation, she unclipped his leash. "Be careful, boy." Max bounded into the darkness, disappearing into the tree line behind the diner. Maggie's heart pounded as she strained to follow his movement in the shadows. The wind bit at her exposed face as she waited, calling his name softly. "Max? Max, come back now." After what felt like forever, but was probably only minutes, she heard the crunch of snow under paws. Max emerged from the darkness, carrying something small and limp in his mouth. Maggie's heart jumped to her throat until she saw the gentle way he held his burden. "Oh, you scared me half to death," she scolded, but her voice was gentle. Max padded up to her, carefully depositing a tiny, shivering bundle at her feet. Without hesitation, Maggie unwrapped her scarf and scooped up the creature, gasping at how cold it felt through her gloves. Back inside the diner's warmth, Maggie laid her precious cargo on the counter. Under the bright lights, she got her first good look at what she'd assumed was a puppy. But the delicate pointed face, the distinctive markings, and especially that bushy little tail told a different story. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, carefully tucking the fox kit into a box she'd lined with a clean towel from the kitchen. "Looks like we're taking an unexpected guest home tonight, Max." The clock read 8 p.m. as Maggie gathered her things again, holding the box close to her body for warmth. The night had grown darker, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the winter silence. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through Maggie's living room windows, casting a warm glow on the worn hardwood floors. She sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in her old flannel robe, her hands cupped around a steaming mug of coffee. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth reaching across the room to where Max lay protectively near the makeshift bed she'd created for the Fox Kit. "You're quite the guardian angel, aren't you?" Maggie whispered to Max, who responded with a gentle thump of his tail against the floor. Her eyes drifted to the tiny fox, curled up in the basket lined with her softest old blanket. Its chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a small victory after the bitter cold of last night. The morning ticked by slowly as Maggie wrestled with what to do next. She reached for the phone several times, her fingers hovering over the numbers for animal control, but something held her back. Each time she looked at the kit's frail body, her heart clenched at the sight of the angry red marks across its legs and stomach. These weren't natural injuries. They told a story of cruelty that made her blood boil. "Those aren't from living wild, are they, Max?" she murmured, setting down her coffee cup. The German shepherd's ears perked up as she moved to the kitchen, where she rummaged through drawers until she found an old medicine dropper. Her mind wandered to the whispered conversations she'd overheard at the diner over the past few months. Rumors about strange noises in the woods at night, about trucks coming and going at odd hours. Working quickly, Maggie warmed some milk on the stove and stirred in a spoonful of honey. "Now comes the tricky part," she told Max, who had followed her into the kitchen. She filled the dropper and returned to the living room, kneeling beside the basket. The Fox Kit's eyes fluttered open as she approached, dark, frightened eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young creature. With gentle movements, Maggie offered the dropper. At first, the kit turned away, but hunger won out over fear. Drop by drop, it accepted the warm mixture. "That's it, little one," Maggie encouraged softly. "You're safe now." Max inched closer, his nose twitching with interest as he watched the feeding. Maggie knew keeping a wild animal was risky, especially in town. "We'll have to keep this our secret," she confided in Max. "At least until we figure out what happened to this little one." She thought again about those suspicious activities in the woods, about the peculiar scars that spoke of cages and constraints rather than natural mishaps. As the morning light grew stronger, Maggie stroked Max's head, her resolve strengthening with each passing moment. "No one's going to hurt it again," she promised, watching as the kit drifted back to sleep, its belly finally full. The winter dawn painted the sky in shades of pale gray as Maggie steered her old pickup truck into the empty parking lot of Carter's Comfort. Her breath formed little clouds in the frigid air as she pulled her wool scarf tighter around her neck. The day's specials danced through her mind. Pot roast with root vegetables, Clara's famous apple pie, maybe that new chicken soup recipe she'd been wanting to try. Her thoughts scattered like startled birds when she caught sight of the diner's front windows. Shards of glass littered the sidewalk, glinting like cruel diamonds in the early morning light. Her steps faltered as she drew closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. Bright red spray paint screamed across the remaining window pane. "Mind your business, Maggie." Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed Sheriff Hank Dawson's number. While waiting, she hugged herself against more than just the cold, her eyes fixed on those angry red letters. Within 15 minutes, Hank's patrol car rolled into the lot, his tires crunching over loose glass. The sheriff, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair, emerged with a grunt. "Probably just kids acting tough," he said, barely glancing at the graffiti. "We've had some trouble with teenagers lately. You know how it is." "Kids?" Maggie's voice cracked. "Hank, this message, it's addressed to me, specifically." When she mentioned the injured Fox Kit she'd found, Hank's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Best keep safe, Maggie. Sometimes caring folks like you can get wrapped up in things they shouldn't." Claire arrived just as Hank was leaving, her round face flushed from hurrying. "Oh, my lord!" "Maggie, what happened?" She immediately grabbed a broom and dustpan, her usual chatter subdued to worried murmurs. Together, they swept up the glass and covered the broken windows with plywood from the hardware store next door. Maggie moved through the morning in a daze, serving coffee and chatting with regulars as if everything was normal. But her smile felt stretched thin, and her eyes kept darting to those boards covering the windows. "Are you sure you're okay?" Clara asked more than once, her kind face creased with concern. "Just vandals," Maggie would reply, forcing brightness into her voice. "Nothing to worry about." The day dragged on until closing time. As Maggie locked up alone in the growing darkness, each shadow seemed to hold a threat. The parking lot felt enormous as she walked to her truck, her keys clutched tightly in her fist. The message on the window kept echoing in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far more than a random act of vandalism. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Maggie wiped down her counters, the familiar motion usually bringing her comfort after a long day. But tonight, her nerves still jangled from the vandalism at the diner. Mac's sudden whining cut through her thoughts. She turned to see him pacing near the back door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. "What's wrong, boy?" Maggie asked, setting down her dishcloth. Mac's ears perked forward, and he scratched at the door, letting out another urgent whine. Maggie glanced at the fox kit sleeping peacefully in its basket by the fireplace. The tiny creature had barely moved all day, except to take some more milk from the makeshift bottle she'd created. Her practical side told her to ignore Mac's restlessness, but something in his behavior seemed different tonight. "Oh, all right," she sighed, reaching for her heavy winter coat and grabbing the flashlight from the drawer near the door. "But just a quick look." The bitter cold hit her face like a slap as she stepped onto her back porch. Max bounded down the steps and headed straight for the tree line, his dark form barely visible against the shadows. Maggie's flashlight beam bounced across the snowy ground as she followed, her boots crunching through the crusty surface. "Max, slow down!" she called, her breath clouding in front of her face. The woods felt different at night, the familiar trees transforming into looming shapes that seemed to watch her every move. Max led her deeper into the forest, weaving between trees with purpose. After about 10 minutes, he stopped abruptly, nose pointing toward something partially buried under leaves and snow. Maggie swept her flashlight beam across the ground, revealing the rusted edges of what looked like a large cage. Her gloved hands trembled as she brushed away the debris. The cage was big enough to hold several animals, with a heavy padlock on its door. What caught her eye was a small metal plate welded to one side, some kind of logo or insignia she didn't recognize. Pulling out her phone, Maggie snapped several pictures, making sure to get clear shots of the strange symbol. As she straightened up, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond her flashlight's reach. Max's head jerked toward the sound, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Time to go," Maggie whispered, backing away slowly. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as they hurried home, every shadow seeming to hide watching eyes. Back in her warm living room, Maggie's hands shook as she typed various descriptions of the logo into her laptop's search bar. After an hour of dead ends, she sat back in her chair, frustrated and worried. The fox kit stirred in its sleep, reminding her of someone who might have answers. Her sister Paula, the wildlife biologist. Maggie stared at her phone, Paula's number still saved after all these years. The thought of calling after their bitter falling out made her stomach clench, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. The morning sunlight streamed through Maggie's kitchen window, casting long shadows across her worn wooden table. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers as she stared at her phone. Max lay at her feet, his chin resting on her slipper, while the fox kit slept soundly in its basket near the radiator. "What do you think, Max?" Maggie whispered. "Should I call her?" The The German Shepherd's tail thumped against the floor twice, but his eyes remained closed. Maggie smiled despite her nervousness. She could still hear Paula's angry words from their last fight, could still see her sister storming out of their father's house, suitcase in hand, vowing never to return to this backwards little town. That was 12 years ago. Their father had passed away since then, and they'd only exchanged brief, awkward phone calls at Christmas and birthdays. Paula had built a successful career as a wildlife biologist in the city, while Maggie had stayed behind to run the diner and care for their father in his final years. Maggie's thumb hovered over Paula's number. The fox kit let out a tiny whimper in its sleep, and that small sound gave her the courage she needed. She pressed call before she could change her mind. The phone rang 4 times before Paula answered with a clipped, "Hello? Paula, it's Maggie." "I know. Is everything okay?" Paula's tone was guarded, professional. I need your help with something." Maggie's voice shook slightly. "I found an injured fox kit, and there's something strange going on in the woods behind my house." "Maggie, I'm not the person to call for family favors anymore." Paula's words came out sharp and fast. "There must be local wildlife services." "Please, just listen," Maggie interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "This isn't about family favors. The kit has scars, Paula. Deliberate ones. And Max found a cage in the woods with some kind of logo on it. Someone vandalized my diner, telling me to mind my own business. Something's wrong here, and you're the only person I know who might understand what's happening." The silence stretched so long that Maggie checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, Paula sighed. "One day," she said. "I can spare one day to come look at your fox and this cage. That's it." "Thank you," Maggie breathed. "When can you—" "I'll be there this afternoon," Paula cut in. "Don't expect anything more than a professional consultation." The line went dead before Maggie could respond. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous cleaning. Maggie changed the sheets in the guest room twice, dusted surfaces that hadn't seen a cloth in months, and reorganized the medicine cabinet 3 times. Every car that passed made her heart jump, wondering if Paula had changed her mind. By late afternoon, Maggie stood at her living room window, watching the road and fighting the urge to call her sister again. The fox kit had eaten well at lunch, which she took as a good sign, but her stomach was still tied in knots about Paula's visit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maggie's driveway as a sleek silver hybrid pulled up. Paula stepped out, her city-smart wool jacket and designer boots a stark contrast to the rural setting. Max's excited barking broke the silence, pulling against Maggie's firm grip on his collar. "Easy, boy," Maggie murmured, both to Max and herself. Her sister looked exactly as she remembered, yet somehow more distant, like a photograph that had faded around the edges. "Hi, Maggie." Paula's voice was controlled, professional. She stepped forward for a quick, awkward hug that lasted barely a second. The scent of her expensive perfume lingered in the cold air between them. Inside, Paula's demeanor changed the moment she saw the fox kit. Her eyes widened, and she immediately knelt beside the basket, professional interest overtaking her earlier reserve. "This is a red fox kit, but not our common variety," she said, gently examining the tiny creature. "These markings, this could be an endangered subspecies. Where exactly did you find it?" Maggie explained about Max discovering the kit, watching as her sister's expression grew increasingly concerned. When she mentioned the cage in the woods, Paula's head snapped up. "Show me the photos." Maggie pulled out her phone, describing the strange insignia while Paula studied the images intently. The fox kit whimpered, drawing Paula's attention back to its injuries. "These scars—" Paula's fingers ghosted over the kit's fur. "This wasn't from natural causes. Someone did this deliberately." Like the people who vandalized my diner? Maggie asked quietly. Paula's eyes narrowed. You didn't mention that on the phone. What vandalism? As Maggie described the incident, Paula's expression hardened. This is exactly like you, Maggie. Always trying to handle everything yourself, pretending problems don't exist until they're breaking down your door. That's not fair, Maggie protested, feeling the familiar hurt rise in her chest. I called you, didn't I? After how long? After someone threatened you? Paula stood up, pacing the room. Just like with Dad's drinking, you just kept serving him coffee at the diner, pretending everything was fine. While you ran away to the city? Maggie's voice cracked. Someone had to stay. Someone had to take care of him. The fox kit stirred in its basket, letting out a small cry that seemed to deflate their rising anger. Both sisters turned to look at it, their shared concern momentarily bridging the gulf between them. Paula sighed, running a hand through her hair. This fox's presence here isn't accidental. These traffickers, they're organized, dangerous. You need to be careful, Maggie. Very careful. Maggie nodded, tucking the blanket more securely around the sleeping kit. The clock on the mantel showed 9 p.m., and as she watched her sister stare out the window into the darkness, she wondered how they'd grown so far apart. The morning frost crunched under their boots as Maggie and Paula followed Max deeper into the woods behind the house. Paula clutched her professional camera and notebook, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Maggie hugged herself, partly from cold and partly from anxiety about what they might discover. Max knows these woods better than anyone, Maggie said, trying to break the awkward silence between them. He walks them with me every day. Paula nodded curtly, her eyes scanning the ground. That's why we need him. Animals can sense things we might miss. She stopped suddenly, crouching to examine something. Look here, cigarette butts, fresh ones. Maggie's stomach tightened as they followed the trail of discarded cigarettes. The trees thinned out into a small clearing, where Max began growling softly. There, partially hidden under dead leaves and branches, lay another cage. This one was larger than the first, its metal bars twisted and rusted. Same insignia, Paula muttered, snapping photos from different angles. She pulled out her notebook and started sketching the scene. This is definitely part of a larger operation. These cages are professional grade, expensive. They're designed for transport. Maggie wrapped her arms tighter around herself. How could this happen here? In our town? Rural areas are perfect for trafficking operations, Paula explained, her voice taking on a familiar lecturer's tone. Lots of space, few witnesses, easy access to highways. But this, she gestured at the cage, this is organized. Someone local has to be involved. Someone with money and connections. The weight of Paula's words settled heavily on Maggie's shoulders. How many times had she walked these woods, never noticing what was happening right under her nose? The fox kit's scared eyes flashed in her mind, and guilt gnawed at her chest. Back at the diner, Maggie moved mechanically through her tasks, her mind still in the woods. As she refilled coffee cups, she noticed Sylvia Whitaker sitting alone in the corner booth, stirring her untouched soup. Something about Sylvia's demeanor caught Maggie's attention. The way she flinched at sudden movements, how her eyes darted nervously around the room, never meeting anyone's gaze. Maggie watched as Sylvia's trembling hands wrapped around her coffee cup. Her wedding ring, the one everyone in town knew Robert Whitaker had imported from Europe, catching the afternoon light. The usually well-put-together woman looked pale and drawn, her designer clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Setting down the coffee pot, Maggie glanced at the clock. 1 p.m. She had a few more tables to check, but something about Sylvia's unusual behavior tugged at her instincts. Once she finished with her current customers, she would try to talk to her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows as Maggie watched Sylvia Whitaker push a piece of apple pie around her plate. The fork scraped against the ceramic, making tiny scratching sounds that seemed too loud in the quiet corner. Sylvia's once perfectly manicured nails were bitten down to the quick, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Maggie grabbed the coffee pot and approached the booth. Without waiting for an invitation, she slid into the seat across from Sylvia, who startled slightly at the sudden company. "It's been a while, Sylvia," Maggie said warmly, filling her cup. "You used to come in every Tuesday for the pot roast special." Sylvia wrapped her hands around the steaming mug but didn't drink. "I've been busy," she murmured, her eyes darting to the diner's entrance every few minutes. "A whole year of busy?" Maggie kept her voice gentle, noting how Sylvia's shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make herself smaller. "That's a long time to go without my famous pie." A weak smile flickered across Sylvia's face. "Things at home have been complicated." She straightened her silverware with trembling fingers. "Robert's business keeps us both very occupied." "I heard about his new shipping warehouse outside town," Maggie said carefully. "Quite an expansion." Sylvia's hand jerked, rattling the coffee cup in its saucer. "Yes, he's very successful." She dabbed at invisible crumbs with her napkin. "How have you been, Maggie? I noticed the broken windows. Terrible thing." "Strange timing," Maggie replied, watching Sylvia's reaction. "Right after I found something interesting in the woods behind my house." The color drained from Sylvia's face. "Maggie," she whispered, leaning forward, "you need to be careful. Some things are better left alone." "Like animal trafficking?" Maggie asked quietly. Sylvia's eyes went wide with fear. She gripped her purse tightly. "You don't understand. There are people, important people, who won't appreciate questions. The vandalism was just a warning. Next time—" She swallowed hard. "Please, Maggie, for your own safety, forget what you saw." "Sylvia, if you know something—" "I can't," Sylvia cut her off, her voice breaking. "Robert has connections, the kind that make problems disappear." She stood abruptly, leaving a $20 bill on the table. "I shouldn't have come. I'm sorry." Maggie watched her hurry toward the door, noting how Sylvia's expensive wool coat hung loose on her frame. She needed to talk to Sylvia somewhere safe, somewhere away from prying eyes. Perhaps an invitation to her house would give Sylvia the security she needed to open up. The evening shadows lengthened as Maggie paced her living room, adjusting throw pillows that didn't need adjusting. Max watched her from his spot near the Fox-Kits basket, his ears perking up at every sound from outside. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but even its warmth couldn't ease the knot in Maggie's stomach. At precisely 7 o'clock, a gentle knock made Max raise his head. Maggie opened the door to find Sylvia Whitaker standing on her porch, wrapped in an expensive wool coat. Her eyes darted past Maggie, scanning the darkness behind her. Come in," Maggie urged, ushering her inside. "Would you like some tea?" Sylvia nodded, perching on the edge of the sofa like a bird ready to take flight. Her perfectly styled hair couldn't hide how pale and drawn her face looked in the firelight. Max approached her slowly, resting his head on her knee in a gesture of comfort that made her eyes well with tears. "It's safe here," Maggie said softly, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "Whatever you need to say, it won't leave this room." Sylvia's hand shook as she accepted the tea. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If Robert finds out—" She trailed off, staring into her cup. "How long has it been going on?" Maggie asked gently. Tears spilled down Sylvia's cheeks. 3 years, maybe longer. I didn't want to know at first." She took a shuddering breath. "The shipping company is just a cover. Robert uses it to move exotic animals through the area. He has warehouses, connections with corrupt officials. The money is—" She shook her head. "It's blood money, all of it." Sylvia reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew a leather-bound book. "I copied his ledger. Names, dates, locations. Everything's here." She thrust it at Maggie as if it burned her fingers. "But I can't. I can't testify. He'll take Tommy away from me. He has judges in his pocket, Maggie. He'll make sure I never see my son again." Maggie held the ledger, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. The fox kit stirred in its basket, letting out a tiny whimper that made Sylvia flinch. "Keep it hidden," Sylvia pleaded, standing abruptly. "Robert has eyes everywhere. If he discovers it's missing—" She pulled her coat tighter. "I should go. I've already stayed too long." After Sylvia left, Maggie stood in front of her old floor safe, turning the dial with practiced fingers. The ledger felt heavy as she placed it inside, the metallic click of the lock echoing in the quiet room. She settled into her chair by the fire, Mac's head resting on her lap, and stared at the safe that now held enough evidence to bring down Robert Whitaker's empire. The early morning sun filtered through Maggie's kitchen window, casting a pale glow on the worn wooden table where she sat with Paula. Between them lay Sylvia's ledger, its pages filled with damning evidence. Steam rose from their coffee cups, untouched, as they pored over the numbers and names that painted a disturbing picture. "Look at these shipping dates," Paula said, her finger tracing a column of figures. "They line up perfectly with the full moon each month. Less chance of being spotted in the darkness." Her years of wildlife conservation experience showed in how quickly she pieced together the patterns. Max dozed nearby, occasionally opening one eye to check on the fox kit, which was curled up in its basket. The little creature's coat had begun to shine, and its eyes were brighter. Small victories that made Maggie's heart swell. "Here," Paula pointed to a familiar name. "Whitaker Logistics. That insignia we found on the cage? It's their old company logo." She pulled out her phone, showing Maggie a website. "They've been investigated 3 times in other states, but nothing ever stuck." Maggie wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth. "We should tell Sheriff Dawson." "No." Paula's voice was sharp. "Look at these payment records. Someone in local law enforcement is getting regular deposits." She tapped another column of numbers. "Too much money for a small-town sheriff to explain." "Hank's been coming to my diner for years," Maggie protested, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "That's your problem, Mag. You want to see the good in everyone." Paula's words were harsh, but her tone had softened. "Sometimes there isn't any good to find." "And you're too quick to assume the worst," Maggie shot back. Then she sighed, remembering how their father used to say they were 2 sides of the same coin. "But you're probably right about Hank." Paula reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand, the first real gesture of affection since arriving. "We need more proof before we can go to the state authorities. People in town must know something." Maggie nodded slowly. "We'll have to be careful who we talk to. Robert has eyes everywhere." "Let me handle the technical stuff," Paula said, already making notes. "You know these people, their routines, their stories. They trust you." The sisters looked at each other, years of distance melting away in the face of their shared purpose. The fox kit stirred in its basket, letting out a tiny yawn that made them both smile. "I should get to the diner," Maggie said, standing up. "People talk more freely over breakfast." Paula nodded, turning back to the ledger. "I'll dig deeper into these records. There's a pattern here. We just need to find it." The late morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. Maggie wiped down the counter with practiced motions while keeping an eye on her sister. Paula sat in the corner booth, her notebook open but partially hidden behind a menu, jotting down observations with quick, efficient strokes. "More coffee, Mrs. Henderson?" Maggie asked, approaching an elderly woman who frequently led the church's outreach programs. "Say, I've been thinking about organizing something for the community. You know, to help protect our local wildlife." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful, dear. Just the other day, I was telling Harold about all those strange trucks going up and down Maple Road. You know, near the Whitaker place. At all hours, too." Maggie nodded, carefully keeping her expression neutral. "Really? That's interesting. I wonder if it has something to do with his shipping business." Throughout the day, more pieces fell into place. Tom Fisher, who worked the night shift at the gas station, mentioned seeing convoys of unmarked vehicles around midnight. Sarah from the grocery store spoke about deliveries that never seemed to match up with their manifests. Clara, wiping down tables nearby, chimed in quietly. "My brother works security at the industrial park. Says there's been lots of activity at those old warehouses lately. Weird sounds, too, like animals." Paula documented everything, her pen moving steadily across the pages. When customers asked about her presence, Maggie simply introduced her as her sister visiting from the city, interested in small-town life. By mid-afternoon, Maggie had arranged a church group meeting for the following week. "We'll discuss ways to protect our local wildlife," she explained to the organizing committee. "Maybe set up some neighborhood watch programs." The regulars responded enthusiastically, sharing stories of unusual sightings in the woods and expressing concern about environmental preservation. Each conversation added another thread to the web they were uncovering. Later, as the afternoon crowd thinned, Paula spread her notes across the counter during a quiet moment. "Look at this pattern," she whispered. The truck sightings align perfectly with the shipping dates in Sylvia's ledger. And these warehouse locations? They're all owned by Whitaker Shell Companies. Maggie felt a surge of determination as she looked at the evidence mounting before them. The community's willingness to help, even unknowingly, gave her strength. These were her people, and someone was taking advantage of their trust. As the day wound down and the last customer left, Maggie locked the diner's door with renewed purpose. The sisters gathered their notes and headed home, where they settled at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, ready to organize their findings and plan their next steps. The night wrapped around Maggie's house like a thick blanket, broken only by the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She had just started dozing off when Mac's low growl jolted her awake. The German shepherd stood rigid by her bedroom window, his hackles raised and teeth bared. "What is it, boy?" Maggie whispered, her heart pounding. Mac's growl deepened into a series of sharp barks, and he bounded toward the back door. Maggie grabbed her flashlight with trembling hands and followed, her bare feet sliding into her garden boots. The cold air hit her face as she stepped onto the back porch. Max was already racing toward the Fox-Kits enclosure, barking furiously at a dark figure near the fence. The beam of her flashlight caught a glimpse of movement. Someone dressed in dark clothing ducking behind the wooden fence panels. "Hey!" Maggie shouted, her voice stronger than she felt. "Get away from there!" The shadowy figure disappeared into the woods, leaving only the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. Her hands shaking, Maggie approached the enclosure. The Fox-Kit was huddled in the corner, trembling but alive. Near the fence, she discovered a disturbing sight, a chunk of raw meat that reeked of chemicals. Her stomach lurched as she realized what it meant. "Paula!" she called out, rushing back inside to wake her sister. Someone tried to poison the kit. They wrapped the frightened animal in a blanket and drove through the dark streets to the veterinary clinic. Dr. Emily Harris, still in her pajamas under her white coat, met them at the emergency entrance. The next hour was a blur of examinations and worried conversations. "The kid ingested a small amount," Dr. Harris explained, her kind face serious. But we caught it in time. The activated charcoal treatment should help, and we'll keep monitoring throughout the night." Paula placed a steady hand on Maggie's shoulder as they watched Dr. Harris tend to the kit. "This means we're getting close," Paula said softly. "Robert wouldn't send someone if he wasn't worried about what we might uncover." Maggie nodded, tears burning in her eyes. She reached out to stroke the kit's fur through the cage bars. "I should have been more careful. Should have had better security." "You couldn't have known," Paula assured her. "But we know now, and we'll be ready next time." The drive home was silent, heavy with exhaustion and worry. Max greeted them at the door, still alert and protective. Maggie carried the sleeping kit, now treated and stable, to its bed. She sat beside it, watching its tiny chest rise and fall. "I promise," she whispered, gently stroking its fur. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." The clock on the wall ticked past 1 a.m. as Maggie finally allowed herself to rest, Max keeping faithful watch at her feet. Golden morning light filtered through Maggie's kitchen windows, casting warm squares on the worn linoleum floor. The fox kit dozed peacefully in its basket, its chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Max hadn't left his guard post since they'd returned from the vet, his watchful eyes fixed on their small charge. Paula sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "You look like you barely slept," she said as Maggie shuffled in, still in her flannel robe. "I kept checking on the kid every hour," Maggie admitted, pouring herself coffee with slightly trembling hands. "I can't shake the feeling that I failed it somehow." "Stop that right now," Paula said firmly, her voice gentler than Maggie remembered from their childhood. "If anything, this proves we're getting close. Robert's feeling threatened enough to take action." Maggie sank into a chair, running her fingers through her disheveled gray hair. "I'm done playing defense, Paula. We need to confront Robert directly." "That's too dangerous," Paula protested, leaning forward. "We need more evidence, more—" "We have the ledger," Maggie interrupted, retrieving it from its hiding place. "And we have Sylvia's testimony if she'll give it." Paula spread the pages across the table, her expert eyes scanning the damning entries. "Let me at least photograph everything first," she said, pulling out her phone. "We need backups." As Paula documented the evidence, Maggie's mind wandered to Robert's upcoming charity gala. The annual event drew the town's most influential citizens, all eager to be seen supporting Robert's supposed philanthropic efforts. "The gala," she said suddenly. "That's where we'll confront him." Paula looked up sharply. "In public? Maggie, that's—" "Perfect," Maggie finished. "He won't be able to hide behind threats and intimidation with the whole town watching." They spent the next hour planning, with Paula suggesting they quietly gather support from trusted community members first. The fox kit stirred in its basket, letting out a tiny yawn that made both sisters smile. "You know what Dad would say about all this?" Paula asked softly. "That sometimes doing the right thing means taking the hardest path," Maggie replied, remembering their father's words. Standing up, Maggie squared her shoulders and looked at her sister. "If this is the fight I'm meant to have, I'm not backing down." The evening shadows stretched long across Maggie's living room as she and Paula sat surrounded by notebooks and papers. Their plans for confronting Robert at the gala were taking shape, but the weight of what they were attempting pressed heavily on both sisters. The fox kit slept soundly in its basket, looking stronger each day, while Max maintained his vigilant post near the front door. "We'll need to time this perfectly," Paula said, marking something in her notebook. "Once we expose Robert at the gala—" A sharp crash from the back of the house cut her off. Max's head snapped up, his ears alert. Before either sister could move, the German Shepherd bounded toward the sound, barking fiercely. "Stay here," Paula whispered, but Maggie was already on her feet. They crept down the hallway together, Paula leading the way. The beam of their flashlight revealed shattered glass scattered across the kitchen floor, glinting like deadly diamonds in the darkness. Cold winter air rushed through a broken window. "No, no, no," Maggie gasped, running to her bedroom. The sight stopped her cold. Drawers pulled out, contents strewn everywhere, her small safe hanging open and empty. "The ledger, it's gone." Paula grabbed her sister's arm. "I have the photos on my phone, remember? We haven't lost everything." Their moment of relief was short-lived, as red and blue lights flashed through the front windows. Sheriff Dawson arrived minutes later, his boots crunching on broken glass as he walked through the house. He took notes with an air of detachment that made Maggie's skin crawl. "Probably just kids looking for cash," he drawled, barely glancing at the ransacked rooms. "We'll keep an eye out, but don't get your hopes up about recovering anything." After he left, Paula immediately pulled out her phone. "I'm uploading these photos to secure cloud storage right now. Multiple copies encrypted. They can't take what they can't find." Maggie stood at her kitchen window, staring into the darkness. The Fox kit had slept through the whole ordeal, but Max pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. "They're trying to scare us off," she said quietly. "Are they succeeding?" Paula asked, pausing in her work. Maggie's jaw set firmly. "No, they just proved how desperate they are to keep us quiet. We're going to that gala, and we're going to expose everything." The sisters spent the next hour securing the house, Paula helping Maggie nail boards over the broken window while Max patrolled restlessly. By 11, every door was double-checked, every window latched and tested. But even as Maggie prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the break-in was just the beginning. Maggie stood before her bedroom mirror, smoothing down the navy blue dress she'd bought years ago for her niece's wedding. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, so different from her usual diner uniform or comfortable sweaters. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened a simple pearl necklace, her mother's, around her neck. Paula appeared behind her, dressed in a sleek black pantsuit that exuded confidence. "You look perfect," she assured, helping Maggie adjust the dress's shoulder. "Remember, we have everything backed up. All the evidence is secure." "I feel like I'm wearing a costume," Maggie admitted, touching her carefully styled gray hair. "Like I'm pretending to be someone else." "You're not pretending," Paula said firmly. "You're exactly who you need to be. Someone brave enough to stand up for what's right." The sisters arrived at Whitaker Estate just as the sun was setting. The mansion loomed before them, its windows blazing with light. Valets in crisp uniforms whisked away expensive cars, while string quartet music drifted through the evening air. Maggie's sensible sedan looked out of place among the luxury vehicles. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathering. Women in designer dresses clutched champagne flutes, while men in tuxedos engaged in apparently important conversations. Maggie recognized several faces. People who ordered coffee and pie at her diner now looked transformed in their formal wear. Paula squeezed her arm and nodded toward a woman in a red dress. "That's Sarah Green," she whispered. "I'll handle the handoff. You keep an eye on Robert." As Paula slipped away through the crowd, Maggie watched Robert Whitaker working the room. He moved with practiced ease, touching shoulders, laughing at jokes, playing the gracious host. His charm seemed to cast a spell over the gathering, but Maggie now saw through it to the predator beneath. She noticed James Cooper, Robert's logistics manager, hovering near the bar. He was one of the names from the ledger, responsible for coordinating the animal shipments. Now he was sipping expensive whiskey as if he hadn't contributed to the suffering of countless creatures. Maggie's hands grew clammy as she watched Robert approach the stage. He tapped a knife against his crystal glass, calling for attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with admiring faces. Maggie's heart pounded as she began moving forward, each step bringing her closer to the moment of truth. Paula appeared at her side, giving a slight nod to confirm the evidence was with Sarah. The sisters exchanged a look of determination as Robert began his speech, his voice smooth as honey, but now bitter to Maggie's ears. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. The grand ballroom sparkled under elaborate crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off gilt-edged mirrors and polished marble floors. Robert Whitaker stood at the podium, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo immaculate. His voice carried across the room with practiced authority as he spoke about his dedication to wildlife preservation. "And that's why," he announced, "Whitaker Logistics has committed another $1 million to protecting endangered species in our region." Maggie's hands trembled as she clutched her small purse containing the copied evidence. Paula stood nearby, giving her a subtle nod. The crowd's polite applause felt like thunder in Maggie's ears as she stepped forward. "That's a lie!" Her voice rang out clear and strong, surprising even herself. The applause died instantly. "You're not protecting wildlife. You're trafficking endangered animals for profit." Robert's smile barely faltered as he peered down at her. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you're passionate about animals, but this is hardly the time or place. I have proof." Maggie pulled out the copied ledger pages, her voice growing stronger. "These documents show exactly how your company moves exotic animals through fake shipping manifests. They show the bribes, the cover-ups, everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "These are serious and completely unfounded accusations." "I found one of your victims," Maggie continued, her voice breaking slightly. "A fox kit covered in scars from your cages, left to die in the woods behind my house. How many other animals have you tortured for profit, Robert?" Sarah Green stepped forward, her red dress bright against the sea of black tuxedos. "I have copies of all the evidence, Mr. Whitaker, including photographs of the cages bearing your company's logo. Care to comment for my article?" The whispers grew louder. Robert's carefully maintained facade began to crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tugged at his bow tie. "These are outrageous claims," he sputtered, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. "I won't stand here and—" "Then explain the ledger," Maggie demanded. "Explain the matching dates, the payments, the locations. Explain why your wife is terrified of you." The crowd's murmuring turned to open discussion. Several prominent donors began moving toward the exits, while others demanded answers. Robert tried to step away from the podium, but the growing crowd of angry guests blocked his path. Maggie stood firm, her chin held high, as chaos erupted around her. The carefully orchestrated gala dissolved into confusion and angry voices. Robert's face had gone from red to pale, his composure completely shattered as he faced the consequences of his actions. The grand ballroom descended into chaos as Robert's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Guests clustered in small groups, their whispers growing louder with each passing moment. Some headed for the exits, while others moved closer to the stage, demanding answers. "These records show shipments through the old Miller warehouse," Maggie declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Every Tuesday night for the past 6 months. "I've seen those trucks," called out George Peterson, owner of the local hardware store. "Always thought it was strange. Having deliveries that late?" Sarah Green stepped forward, her reporter's notebook in hand. "I have copies of all documentation secured in multiple locations," she announced. "The full story runs tomorrow morning, complete with photographs and witness statements." Robert's face reddened as he gripped the podium. "This is ridiculous. A simple diner owner trying to slander me because she's jealous of success. Who are you going to believe?" "I believe her." Sylvia's quiet voice cut through the noise. She stood trembling in her blue evening gown, tears streaming down her face. "Everything she's saying is true. I've watched it happen for years, Robert. I can't stay quiet anymore." Robert's composure shattered. He lunged toward the nearest exit, shoving past elderly Mrs. Thompson. 2 security guards blocked his path, their faces grim. "The police are already on their way," Paula announced, holding up her phone, "and the state wildlife authorities have been notified." The sound of sirens grew louder outside the mansion. Robert spun around, looking for another escape route, but found himself surrounded by former friends and associates, who now stared at him with disgust and betrayal. "You don't understand," he sputtered, his designer suit suddenly seeming to hang loose on his frame. "This town needs me. My business brings jobs, prosperity." "We don't need prosperity built on cruelty," Maggie replied firmly. She thought of the scarred fox kit safe at home with Max, of all the other animals that had suffered. Blue and red lights flashed through the ballroom's tall windows as police cars pulled up the circular driveway. The heavy double doors opened, and Sheriff Dawson entered, followed by state police officers. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor as they approached Robert. Maggie watched as the officers read Robert his rights, her heart pounding, but her stance unwavering. Paula squeezed her shoulder in silent support, while Sarah Green scribbled furiously in her notebook. Around them, the shocked murmurs of the town's elite continued to fill the opulent space that had once been Robert's sanctuary. Blue and red lights painted the elegant facade of the Whitaker estate in alternating colors. Police cars lined the circular driveway, their presence drawing curious onlookers from neighboring properties. Maggie stood between Paula and Sarah Green, watching as 2 officers led Robert Whitaker down the marble steps in handcuffs. "This isn't over," Robert shouted, his perfectly tailored tuxedo now wrinkled and disheveled. "You'll regret this, Maggie Carter." Paula squeezed her sister's arm. "Don't listen to him, he's finished." Sheriff Dawson's cruiser pulled up, tires crunching on the gravel. He emerged, adjusting his badge with an exaggerated look of surprise. "What in the world is going on here?" "Don't pretend you didn't know," Maggie said, her voice carrying across the driveway. "Those vandalized windows at my diner, the suspicious activities in the woods, you ignored every sign." The sheriff's face reddened. "Now, Maggie, you know I investigated—" "Save it for the state investigators," Paula interrupted, stepping forward with her phone. "I've got copies of everything, dates, times, locations, including reports that were conveniently lost at your office." 2 plainclothes detectives approached, introducing themselves as being from the state police. Paula handed over her phone, explaining the digital trail of evidence. "I've backed everything up securely," she assured them. "Multiple copies, multiple locations." Robert continued shouting from the back of a police car, his words muffled by the closed windows. The gathered crowd of reporters surged forward, cameras flashing as Sarah Green began sharing details of her upcoming story. Sylvia emerged from the mansion, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the evening. Her eyes were red but clear as she approached Maggie. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered, reaching for Maggie's hand. "I've been afraid for so long, but seeing you stand up to him—" She straightened her shoulders. "I'll testify. Everything I know, everything I've seen. It's time people knew the truth." Maggie squeezed Sylvia's hand. "You're very brave." As the crowd thinned and the excitement began to die down, Maggie and Paula walked together to Maggie's truck. Their footsteps echoed on the pavement, accompanied by the chirp of evening crickets and distant police radios. "Ready to go home?" Paula asked, climbing into the passenger seat. Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of the evening in every muscle. She started the engine, watching the scene in her rearview mirror as they pulled away. The night sky stretched above them, clear and filled with stars, as they headed home to check on Max and the fox kit. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Maggie's living room, casting a warm glow on the peaceful scene before her. In his basket by the hearth, the fox kit dozed contentedly, his chest rising and falling in gentle rhythm. Max maintained his faithful vigil nearby, his brown eyes occasionally drifting to check on his small charge. Maggie settled deeper into her favorite armchair, wrapping both hands around her steaming coffee mug. Paula sat across from her on the sofa, looking more relaxed than Maggie had seen her in years. "I still can't believe how many people showed up to support us last night," Maggie said softly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Even old Mrs. Henderson from the quilting circle was there, waving her cane and demanding justice. Paula chuckled. "That's what happens when you spend years building trust in a community. They stand behind you when it matters." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "You know, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to fight for something meaningful. Working in the city, getting tangled in red tape and bureaucracy, I lost sight of why I became a wildlife biologist in the first place." "And what was that reason?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. "To protect creatures like this little one," Paula replied, gesturing toward the sleeping kit. "To make a real difference, not just push papers around a desk." The sisters sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the fox kit stretched and yawned, showing tiny white teeth. Max's tail thumped against the floor in response. "I've been thinking," Maggie said, setting down her coffee. "It's time this little fellow had a proper name. I'd like to call him Hope." Paula's eyes softened. "Hope," she repeated. "Because he brought us back together? Because he reminded me that even when things seem darkest, there's always hope for something better." Maggie stood and walked to a drawer, pulling out a small blue ribbon she'd been saving for this moment. With gentle hands, she tied the ribbon loosely around Hope's neck, careful not to disturb his rest. The kit blinked sleepily at her, then went right back to sleeping. Max inched closer, resting his head on the edge of the basket. "I'd like us to stay in touch this time," Paula said, joining her sister by the basket. "No more years of silence between us." "I'd like that too," Maggie replied, reaching for her sister's hand. Together, they watched Hope sleep as the morning sun continued its slow climb into the sky. The morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows of Carter's Comfort, casting warm patches of light across the crowded diner. The usual breakfast rush had stretched well into mid-morning as townspeople filtered in and out, eager to discuss the previous night's events. The air hummed with animated conversations and the clinking of coffee cups. Maggie moved between tables, refilling mugs and accepting kind words from her customers. Clara worked double time in the kitchen, cheerfully calling out orders over the din. The atmosphere felt more like a community celebration than a typical business day. "Did you see his face when Mrs. Whitaker stood up?" Betty Thompson, the town librarian, asked her table companions. "I never thought I'd see Robert Whitaker lose his composure like that." Sarah Green pushed through the entrance, clutching a stack of newspapers. She caught Maggie's eye and smiled, making her way to the counter. "Hot off the press," she announced, spreading out the front page. The headline read, "Small Town Heroes, Local Diner Owner Exposes Wildlife Trafficking Ring." The article detailed not just Robert's arrest, but the community's role in bringing him to justice. Several customers gathered around, pointing out their names and contributions. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, cleared his throat. "You know, I saw those trucks late at night for months. Always felt something wasn't right, but..." "We all noticed things," Martha Jenkins added from her booth. "We just didn't know how to speak up." Maggie squeezed Martha's shoulder. "Sometimes it takes one person to start, but it's everyone's small actions that make the difference." The bell above the door chimed, and the diner fell quiet as Sylvia Whitaker stepped inside. She looked tired but determined, her head held high. Making her way to where Maggie stood, she took both of Maggie's hands in hers. "I need everyone to hear this," Sylvia said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "Maggie Carter didn't just expose a criminal operation. She gave me the courage to stand up for what's right. She showed me that being afraid doesn't mean you have to stay silent." Several customers wiped away tears as Sylvia spoke. Paula, who had been quietly observing from the counter, stepped forward with a notepad. "Maybe we could channel this energy into something permanent," she suggested. "A community wildlife protection program?" The idea sparked immediate interest. Customers began calling out suggestions: educational programs, wildlife corridors, community patrols of the woods. Maggie felt overwhelmed by their enthusiasm and support. Standing behind the counter, Maggie raised her hands for attention. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about stopping something wrong," she said. "It was about standing up for what's right in our community. And I promise you, that's something I'll never stop doing." The diner erupted in cheers and applause. Maggie turned back to her work, her heart full, knowing that this was just the beginning of something truly special in their small town. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maggie's front yard when Sylvia's silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Maggie watched her sit in the car for several moments, gripping the steering wheel before finally gathering her courage to step out. She carried a thick manila folder close to her chest like a shield. Maggie opened the door before Sylvia could knock. "Come in," she said warmly. "I just made a fresh pot of coffee." In the kitchen, Sylvia's hands trembled as she placed the folder on the table. "I went back to the house this morning while Robert was still in custody," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more, so much more than what was in the ledger." Maggie poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. "You're very brave to do this, Sylvia." "Am I?" Sylvia's eyes welled with tears. "I've been afraid for so long. Robert, he always made sure I knew what would happen if I ever spoke up. He'd take Tommy away, make sure I never saw our son again." Paula entered from the living room, having heard their voices. She pulled up a chair, her expression softening at Sylvia's distress. "The courts won't let that happen," she assured her. "These documents will help ensure he can't hurt you or Tommy anymore." Sylvia opened the folder, revealing detailed shipping manifests, bank statements, and correspondence with known traffickers. "For 15 years, I watched him build his empire on other people's suffering. He'd come home proud of his latest acquisition, never once thinking about the animals he was destroying or the ecosystems he was damaging." "The evidence you've gathered will be crucial," Paula explained, examining the documents. "The prosecution will want to talk to you about testifying. It won't be easy. Robert's lawyers will try to discredit you." "But you won't be alone," Maggie added, reaching across the table to squeeze Sylvia's hand. "This whole town has seen Robert's true colors now. We'll stand behind you." Sylvia straightened her shoulders, a new resolve appearing in her eyes. "Tommy deserves to see his mother stand up for what's right. I can't hide anymore." They spent the next hour reviewing the documents and discussing what to expect in the coming weeks. Paula outlined the likely legal proceedings, while Maggie offered practical support: a safe place to stay, help with Tommy, whatever Sylvia might need. When Sylvia finally stood to leave, she looked different, stronger, more determined. "Thank you both," she said, hugging first Maggie, then Paula. "I never thought I'd find the strength to do this." Maggie walked her to her car, watching as Sylvia settled behind the wheel with newfound confidence. The Mercedes backed out of the driveway, and Sylvia gave a small wave before driving away, her posture noticeably straighter than when she'd arrived. The morning sunlight streamed through Maggie's kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the wooden table where she sat with Paula. Steam rose from their coffee cups as the sisters shared quiet laughter over plates of scrambled eggs and toast. Max lounged nearby, occasionally thumping his tail against the floor when one of them spoke particularly loudly. "Remember when Dad caught us trying to rescue those baby rabbits from Mrs. Henderson's garden?" Paula asked, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "He was so mad, but then he helped us build that little hutch anyway." Maggie nodded, her eyes crinkling with joy. "He always did have a soft spot for animals, just like us. Though I think he drew the line at the raccoon family we tried to adopt." Paula set her coffee mug down, glancing toward the living room, where Hope, the rescued fox kit, slept peacefully. "I've been thinking, maybe I could stay a while," she said. Maggie's heart swelled. Together, they could protect local wildlife and strengthen their bond, which had been fractured for years. Paula gifted Maggie a beautifully bound book on fox care, rekindling their shared love for advocacy. Over the weeks, Hope transformed from a fragile, injured kit into a playful, energetic companion. Max, Maggie's loyal German Shepherd, became Hope's gentle protector. As they expanded Hope's enclosure, Paula and Maggie collaborated closely, rebuilding their relationship while ensuring Hope's safety and happiness. Inspired by Hope, Maggie launched a community initiative to protect local wildlife and combat trafficking. At a packed town hall meeting, she and Paula shared their vision, galvanizing neighbors and officials. Plans for patrols, education programs, and stricter laws took shape, uniting the community. Back home, Maggie sat on her porch, Hope curled on her lap, and Max at her feet. Paula joined her with tea, sharing news of partnerships with wildlife sanctuaries. Neighbors expressed gratitude, bringing muffins and stories of inspired children. The once quiet life Maggie thought lonely had blossomed into one of purpose, connection, and joy, all sparked by the tiny fox kit who changed everything. If you enjoyed the story of Maggie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.